in the book that I wrote with Robert Baval, The Master Game, which used to be called Talisman. The Master Game is simply an updated version of Talisman, and my novel Entangled also touches on some of the issues raised in this talk. So there's a question that I think all of us have asked ourselves at some point or another. It's difficult to be alive without, and to be curious without wondering what happens when we die. It's a natural part of the human condition that we do all face death, and various suggestions are proposed. The mainstream religions in one way or another propose that we go to heaven or hell. In other words, that there's some immortal part of some part of ourselves that is not tied to the physical body, which goes on to some destiny beyond physical death. Others are of the opinion that we just meet and we just die, and there is no life after death. There's a whole range of proposals and theories that have been put forward by religions and by science. But I think the bottom line is, honestly, we just don't know. It's a mystery. At least most of us don't know, apart from this chap, Professor Richard Dawkins, formerly Professor of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University. What an Orwellian title he had. Santa and I finally met him when he came to Bath, and I popped up in the audience and tape recorded and asked him a rather embarrassing question, which is whether he would be willing to challenge his view of reality by taking a powerful psychedelic like dimethyltryptamine or ayahuasca, on the grounds that shamanistic peoples believe that these visionary plants give us access to other realities, and would he be willing to challenge his view of reality by exploring one of these shamanistic plants. And he's a skillful political operator, and he said, yeah, he would do it under the right medical supervision if he could be assured that it wasn't harmful to him. He found the idea interesting. He gave a very good answer, actually. And we've pressed him in various ways. Professor David Nutt in London, who used to be the government's chief advisor on drugs, but who was fired when he stated the scientific fact that cannabis is far less harmful than alcohol. They fired him for that, even though the British government had said that its drug policy would be based on science. As soon as Professor David Nutt made his scientific statement about the relative harms of different drugs, we discovered that our government's drug policy was actually based on voodoo, because they fired him. He, following Dawkins saying yes, David Nutt approached Dawkins and said, look, we'll give you psilocybin in a laboratory conditions, but so far it hasn't happened. And friends of mine in Brazil have also offered him 5 ayahuasca sessions, and so far it hasn't happened. We shall see. It would be very interesting. At any rate, here's the interviewer. How do you prepare for death in a world where there isn't a God? Talk about a leading question, And Dawkins replies, you prepare for it by facing up to the truth, which is that life is what we have, so we had better live life to the full while we have it. I can't disagree with that. I believe we should live life to the full. And then he says, because there is nothing after it. That's not a statement of scientific fact. That is not a statement that is based upon any scientific empirical experiments which have proven beyond a shadow of doubt that there is no life after death. Nor, as far as I'm aware, has Professor Dawkins died, found nothing and come back. So it's not based on direct experience either. And actually what Professor Dawkins is stating there is his own particular religious belief. Religion being a faith in unproven things. He has a faith that there is no life after death. And he's very passionate about that faith. And he seeks to convince others that is the case. And it's perfectly acceptable for him to have that belief, but I think where he crosses the line is when he starts to present that belief as an empirically proven fact on the basis of his scientific credentials. And that's wrong, because it's not a fact. It's not in any sense a fact. So, what is this thing called death? Well, there's the widely used legal definition, quite typical of our materialist culture, is that death is the complete cessation of brain function, as evidenced by absence of brainwave activity on an electroencephalogram. But for me, the problem with that statement is, and I feel this quite strongly, is that we are not our brains. We are our consciousness. That is what we are. We are consciousness. And therefore, when we say that the cessation of brainwave activity means death, we are building in a reference frame about the relationship of the brain to consciousness. And actually, consciousness is the greatest mystery of science. We have this 3 or 4 pounds of jelly inside our skulls, and it is definitely involved in consciousness in some extremely important way. But how does this material mass of tissue inside our skulls transmute experiences, the feeling of being in love, our reaction to a beautiful sunset or to a symphony? What is going on there with this material, this material transformation of non-material things into experience? What is the relationship of the brain to consciousness? Now, most scientists who follow the materialist reference frame will tell you that the brain makes consciousness the way a generator makes electricity. And they will give you examples of why they think that, because they'll say, look, if I were to damage a particular area of your brain, or if a particular area of your brain were unfortunately damaged in an accident, certain areas of your consciousness would blink out. They wouldn't be there anymore. They would also be damaged, and therefore it seems to be completely obvious that the brain makes consciousness. Let us remember that it was also for a very long time completely obvious that the sun revolved around the earth. And consider this. I mean, it does, you get up and stand there at dawn, the sun goes up over there, comes across the sky, comes down there. Obviously it revolves around the earth. And this proposition may be rather similar, that the brain makes consciousness the way a generator makes electricity. But there's another possibility, which is that the relationship of consciousness to the brain may be more like the relationship of the TV signal to the TV set. Now, here's the thing. If you damage the TV set, it is going to damage the picture that you get. But the signal is still there, completely intact, perfectly unharmed and unaffected by the damage done to the receiver. And actually, this is the paradigm of all spiritual traditions, that we are non-physical consciousness which incarnates in matter. And that the suggestion then is that the brain may be a receiver or a transceiver of consciousness rather than a generator of consciousness. And all that evidence that materialist science produces to say that the brain makes consciousness works perfectly well with the idea that the brain receives consciousness, and that consciousness is manifests through the brain rather than being made by the brain. I would say, just at the level of reasonable human beings, that any reasonable person should be willing to admit that death's a mystery.
Yo, Baron, what's up, man? How you doing, buddy?
It's a 50-50 shot.
Thanks for being here, man. How you doing?
We have all the anecdotal evidence, and some of it not anecdotal.
Back to back, chilling. That's cool, man.
Stephen's work at the University of Virginia on reincarnation. I mean, he went into reincarnation studies as a skeptic.
Yeah, I felt so much better after lifting some weights yesterday that I think I'm gonna do it again today. So let's do it. Let's get it.
Cases saying that the only rational explanation for his evidence was that reincarnation did happen. Then we have, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, some of which are absolutely intriguing, where the person appears to leave their body and sees things that they couldn't possibly see or know from the prone.
Feeling a lot better than yesterday. I think the working out really helped a lot.
I think once we take all of this anecdotal evidence, ghosts, spirits, encounters, all of this, once we take all of this into account, I think the rational thing to do is to say, actually, it's not a 50-50 shot. It's 51% in favor of some kind of survival of death and 49% the other way. Because the mainstream materialist model doesn't explain any of this other anomalous evidence. It just simply can't explain it any more than the Ptolemaic system could explain the series of anomalies that built up when people started working with telescopes on the heavens and saw the moons of Jupiter and so on and so forth. At any rate, if we want to know about the mystery of death, I feel the very last people we should be going to for advice are materialist scientists, because for them it's not a mystery. They say we're just meat. When you're dead. That's the end. Your consciousness came into existence with your brain. When your brain dies, your consciousness goes out of existence. There is nothing else to know about this story. So really they have nothing to add on the issue of what is death. But people like the ancient Egyptians, who put their best minds to work for thousands of years on the mystery of death, well, they actually have a lot to tell us about death. And if we want to know about this mystery that confronts us all, we would be wise to listen to what cultures like the ancient Egyptians have to say, and the ideas that they expressed in their transcendent art. And here we see the goddess Isis feeding immortal life to Pharaoh Seti I. This is in the temple of Seti I in Abydos. Now, again, the imagery is not producing too well, but on this wall, actually, I think we will go for the screen tomorrow, or not. Well, we won't be here tomorrow. We'll see what we find in Gaziantep. But again, I mean, here we see Isis hovering in the form of a kite over the erect phallus of Osiris, receiving the seed that will produce the divine child Horus. And here we see the initiate connected through the third eye to a star in the sky on the second shrine of Tutankhamun, and here the Ouroboros serpent consuming itself in the endless cycle of time, also from the shrine of Tutankhamun. Ancient Egyptian art is absolutely rich with meaning, and it bears close and careful study. Santa shot this as a double exposure, and what it shows is the Great Pyramid of Giza in the background, and in the foreground, the pyramid, the tomb chamber of the Pyramid of Unas. And Unas was a pharaoh of the late 5th dynasty, some 150 to 200 years after the supposed 4th dynasty had created the pyramids of Giza. And what's interesting is that the pyramids of Giza are absolutely lacking in inscriptions. They are mute. They don't really say anything at all about what. There is some graffiti in the relieving chambers, which is itself quite controversial, but there are no inscriptions. But if you go to the pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties, you find a huge number of hieroglyphic inscriptions, and they're enormously detailed. They're carved on the walls. You see the stars on the ceiling, and you see the hieroglyphs on the walls. And the view that I have taken on this, and Robert Boval and I together did a great deal of work on this, is that perhaps the Great Pyramids are the hardware, and what is written on the walls of the later pyramids is the software, and that if we put the two together, the mute structures of the Great Pyramids and what is said in these texts, then we might begin to learn something about what is going on here. They're very beautiful, the so-called pyramid texts, beautifully inscribed on the walls of the chambers in the 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids. And they are the earliest surviving scriptures of ancient Egypt. Indeed, they're amongst the earliest surviving religious texts from anywhere in the world. And they're part of a body of spiritual knowledge which carried on through the whole 3,000-year story of ancient Egypt. So the pyramid, and we have good, well, arguably good English translations. The ancient Egyptian pyramid text. Then you have the coffin text, so-called because the text is written inside the coffin of the deceased. You have the Book of the Dead, usually on papyrus scrolls buried with the mummy. The Book of What is in the Duat, an extremely interesting text. They're all part of the same system of ideas. And from the oldest to the very latest, they carry that system of ideas down through ancient Egypt. And what they're all about is preparing the deceased for the journey that he or she will make after death. That death is not the end in the ancient Egyptian system, but rather it's the beginning of a new adventure. And that adventure can be extremely testing. And if you're not prepared for that adventure, then woe betide you. And they believe that the deceased must journey through the Duat. The Duat is the afterlife kingdom. And there confront certain riddles and trials and challenges and ordeals. And the duat is two things at least. It's definitely a region of the sky which is quite identifiable and involves the constellations of Orion, the star Sirius, the Milky Way, constellation of Leo. It's a very specific region of the sky, and it is also a physical realm. Narrow corridors and passageways and chambers through which the deceased is guided, sometimes by Anubis, the psychopomp, the guide of souls, and will confront tests and questions which the deceased must be ready to answer. And I think it's whichever stars we choose to connect the Great Pyramids to, and Andy has a different view from me on this, I think their astronomical characteristics are beyond dispute. And something that Robert and I found very interesting is that precisely the region of the sky that can be identified as the duat appears to have been modelled on the ground at Giza. And there are references in the texts to the hidden circle in the sky, the hidden circle of the duat. And what we proposed is that it is hidden in time, that the perfect marriage between sky and ground does not occur in 2500 BC, but 8,000 years earlier in 10,500 BC. So it's as though, as above, so below. This is the terrestrial kingdom of the duat. This is the realm of the dead, ruled over by the god of resurrection, Osiris, whose celestial counterpart was the constellation of Orion. At any rate, I don't think it's possible really to get to grips with the Great Pyramid without getting to grips with the pyramid texts and the whole later body of texts. And I don't think it's possible to get to grips with those texts without getting to grips with the Great Pyramid. And here's a side view of the Great Pyramid. This is the so-called subterranean chamber, which is about 100 feet vertically beneath the base of the pyramid. The descending corridor largely cut through bedrock, which leads down to the subterranean chamber. The ascending corridor that leads you up to the base of the Grand Gallery and to the junction that leads you on the horizontal corridor to the Queen's Chamber. The Grand Gallery itself, the King's Chamber, and the relieving chambers above the King's Chamber. And then there are these curious shafts which emanate from the Queen's Chamber and the King's Chamber. In the case of the King's Chamber shafts, they do actually exit on the outside of the pyramid. In the case of the Queen's Chamber shaft, they don't, and there's been this whole issue of robotic exploration of these shafts. I'm not going to go into that tonight. I may mention it in my other talk. So there we are in the subterranean chamber, 600 feet beneath the apex, 100 feet beneath the base of the Great Pyramid. And that's how it looks today, very nicely cleaned up. But this is how it looked in the early 1900s. When it was a much more spooky and worrying and mysterious place, and not the kind of place in which you would want to get marooned alone in total darkness. Actually, Santa and I have been marooned alone in total darkness in the subterranean chamber. It's quite a challenge to stay there, especially when you remember that Egypt is an earthquake zone, and you are sitting under 6 million tons of pyramid and connected to the surface by a 3 feet 5 inches high and wide shaft. And the mind turns to the prospect of an earthquake and that shaft cracking, and also the darkness. And out of the darkness begin to loom visions and shapes and patterns, and you discover that whatever else the Great Pyramid is, it is an instrument that works upon consciousness. And actually, we can see that today, even with the whole system of ancient Egypt in ruins. Millions, well, not so many millions today with the problems in Egypt, but people for centuries have been drawn to the Great Pyramid. And many have returned transformed by their encounter with the Great Pyramid. So there's something very special going on here. As you come up the descending corridor, you find this gap in the wall, and that leads into the so-called well shaft, which actually connects with the base of the Grand Gallery. This is the descending corridor, carved in large part out of solid rock. And then as we continue up past the junction, we go up the ascending corridor. You can see the kind of thing that you're into here, very narrow corridors and passageways, lit today. But you have to imagine what this would be like in total darkness. There's the junction to the horizontal corridor and the Grand Gallery. And again, this step that leads down into the Queen's Chamber, those shafts in the wall, of the Queen's Chamber, south and north. And there's the Grand Gallery today, 153 feet long, 28 feet high, quite a remarkable construction really. Not so scary when the lights are on, but again, to get a sense of what it was like, this ascent into sort of Stygian gloom, it is worth looking at how it looked 100 years ago or so. And up at the top of it there is the antechamber that leads into the King's Chamber. And I do like this picture because it just does remind me how we're all passing through history, and the Great Pyramid does just stand there forever. And many of us have stood where that lady is standing, and centuries before and centuries after, people will continue to do so and will continue to be puzzled and amazed by this astonishing structure. There's the King's Chamber itself. These words, King's Chamber, Queen's Chamber, they have absolutely no reference to any known facts. They're just what they're called today, but we don't know what they were called in ancient times. Perfect 2x1 rectangle, granite blocks brought from Aswan, 100 of them, 9 50-ton granite blocks in the ceiling. And it's not by chance that one of the ancient names of Giza was Rostau, because the 5th division of the Duat, the most important testing area of the Duat, was called the Land of Sokar and was also known as Rostau. And if you look at the symbolism of the Duat, this is from the tomb of Tutmosis III in the Valley of the Kings, you will see a pyramid, you will see a sphinx, some indication of a chamber. Interesting feathered serpent there, water in tunnels. And what do we have at Giza? We have a pyramid, we have pyramids, we have the sphinx, we have indications of chambers beneath the sphinx, we have indications of tunnels filled with water. It's rather as though this is a three-dimensional representation of this idea. And the curious chambers filled with fiends and monsters seem to be replicated inside the Great Pyramid. The rising galleries of the Duat, the rising gallery of the Grand Gallery. There's even boats buried beside the Great Pyramid. One of them's been reconstructed, and boats were one of the means of transport for the deceased through the Duat. How else do we explain the burial of boats beside the Great Pyramid? It seems to me obvious that the Great Pyramid is a three-dimensional representation of the Duat, and that this is the most important point, and that perhaps it represents what was called the Judgment Hall of Osiris, or the Hall of Ma'at, in the 5th division of the Duat, often approached up a sloping corridor, as the King's Chamber is. And what happens in this hall, it's called the Hall of Ma'at because it's presided over by the goddess Ma'at. That is her symbol, the feather of justice, of truth, of cosmic harmony. But it's also called the Judgment Hall of Osiris because Osiris sits in judgment at the other end of it. And the deceased is brought into the Judgment Hall. And this is really the crucial moment. I love the way that the ancient Egyptians looked at life. It was very deep. It was also in many ways, very forgiving. The ancient Egyptians understood human frailty. They weren't massively judgmental. They understood that we make mistakes in life. But our life is our opportunity to correct the mistakes that we make during it. If we're blessed with a fullness of years, we have the chance to put right the mistakes that we made earlier on. I often compare it, when I look at the ancient Egyptian system, it's rather like a sculptor working on a work of art, on a sculpture, or a painter with a painting, working for years and years and years. And sometimes he or she makes a mistake here or there. And then you work around that mistake and you put it right and you fix it and you don't do it again. And the objective of it would be that at the end of life, you should be able to look back on your life and say, yes, I made mistakes, but by and large, I did good. That's where you should get to at the end of a long life on this planet. And so in a way, because that's what you're tested on when you enter the Judgment Hall of Osiris, what did you do with this gift of life you were given, this precious gift to be born in a human body? Did you use it well, or did you waste it? Did you add to the stock of misery in the world? Did you infringe upon the sovereignty of others? Did you act against the principles of Ma'at, which are the principles of harmony and cosmic truth and justice? Or did you go with the flow of Ma'at? Did you reinforce Ma'at in your life? These are the questions that you're going to be asked. And there is a moral dimension to it. These little guys up here, these are the 42 negative assessors in the Judgment Hall of Osiris. They're going to ask you 42 questions. Ideally, you should be able to answer no to all of those questions. Did you kill? Did you steal? Did you take the name of the gods in vain? All of the 10 commandments actually are there, and 32 others as well. But it's as though moral behavior is necessary but not quite sufficient for what we must do with this life. And as I say, there is room to make mistakes and correct them. It's not that you're doomed with one error. It's what you then do with that error and whether you learn from it and make changes. Here sits Osiris in judgment. Of course, here are the scales, by the way, the most important issue. There is the feather of Ma'at, and there is your soul. This symbolizes the soul of the deceased. And your soul is being weighed in the scales against the feather of Ma'at. You do not want your soul to be heavy with sin. You want it to balance out with Ma'at, with cosmic justice, truth, harmony. Here we have the god Thoth, who's going to write the verdict, the god of wisdom. He's going to write the verdict on his tablet. Here we have Amit, the eater of the dead. He is part hippo, part lion, part hyena. And he is the fate that is reserved for those who have utterly contravened Ma'at during their lives and who have massively added to the misery and pain of others and have impinged and infringed upon others. For them, if they so abuse the gift of life that they were given, there may be no continuance. There may be annihilation. That's what Amit represents. Annihilation, the end of the story. You don't get reborn. You don't come back to learn more. Your story is over at a certain level. As I say, the system is forgiving, and you have to be a pretty bad person to get digested by Amit. And interestingly, it's not only your moral actions, because this scene is actually called the weighing of words, uchamatet, the weighing of words. Some kind of knowledge, some kind of gnosis is implied here. It isn't book learning. You are not required to study books for the test that you will be given in the duat. What you're required to do is to get it somehow, to just get the mystery of life, that you live this period of life in a human body, and a great mystery was involved in it. And at some point you should not attach yourself so massively to material things that you forget the spiritual side of yourself. You need to understand that this is a spiritual journey that we're making in a human body. And that is a revelation. It's not something you learn from books. It's something that you just suddenly get like a blinding flash of light. You suddenly understand the essence of the mystery. Did you get it? That's what's being asked there. And it's rather like the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Meditation, love, ethics, none of these alone can bring enlightenment without wisdom. Amit I've already spoken of. And for those who are justified in the judgment, the deceased asks, how long have I to live? And Thoth replies, thou art for millions of years, a period of life of millions of years. And the ultimate destiny of the soul through many rebirths, interestingly, again we're dealing with symbolism here, but it's fascinating, is to be reborn as a star. That's the end of your journey. You become a star, and then you shed light and life throughout the universe. And we see the soul ascending up amongst the stars on a serpent, interestingly enough here. And again, the feathered, the winged serpent shown here. So there's a Gnostic idea in the ancient Egyptian system, and we would be mistaken to imagine that the ancient Egyptians, in pursuing the mystery of life after death, were simply engaging in an intellectual exercise. They were undoubtedly engaging in altered states of consciousness, which may have been brought on by a variety of different techniques. Be alone in the Great Pyramid long enough and you will go into an altered state of consciousness, believe me. But if you've taken some blue water lily, it might help. And blue water lily appears everywhere in ancient Egyptian imagery. And it is a hallucinogen, as Professor William Embden has demonstrated in his study of visionary plants. And also of interest is this. I mentioned this yesterday, that the ancient Egyptian tree of life is Acacia nilotica. And it is a tree which is rich in dimethyltryptamine, the most powerful hallucinogen known to man. It would take some chemistry to get the DMT out of the bark of the ancient Egyptian tree of life. But then we have to ask ourselves, where actually do we get the word chemistry from? Ancient Egypt was known as Kemet. The Arabs called it Alchemt. That's where we get alchemy from. Ancient Egypt was the origin of chemistry, and they certainly would have been able to liberate DMT from their tree of life. And I don't think it's an accident that it symbolizes the tree of life. I'll have a little more to say about dimethyltryptamine as we go along. A couple of systems of ideas came down from ancient Egypt at the death of ancient Egypt. And the death of ancient Egypt was brought about by a fanatical faction of Christianity combined with the power of Rome. That's what killed Egypt. Greece did not kill Egypt. The Persians did not kill Egypt. As a matter of fact, yes, the Greeks colonized Egypt, but the Egyptians colonized the minds of the Greeks. And the Greeks became more Egyptian than the Egyptians. The Romans too at first were tolerant masters. But when an extreme literalist faction of Christianity promised Constantine that they would be able to save his soul after he'd boiled his wife alive in a bath, he adopted their version of Christianity, which became Roman Catholicism, and that was the death of ancient Egypt. That was what destroyed the ancient Egyptian system. The last temples were still functioning up to about the 400s after Christ, and then they were decommissioned. During this period, two groups of very interesting texts emerged from ancient Egypt. One were the Hermetic texts. Hermes is the Greek form of the ancient Egyptian wisdom god Thoth, and the other was the Gnostic texts. And they have a great deal in common and some differences, but to cut a long story short, what I would say both the Gnostic and the Hermetic texts are doing is they're carrying forward the ancient Egyptian system of ideas into a new world, and they're expressing it in the language of the times, in Greek and Latin. And so souls have at stake in this life their hope of eternity in the life to come. A man's duty is not to acquiesce in his merely human state, but rather in the strength of his contemplation of things divine, to scorn and despise that mortal part which has been attached to him, because it was needful that he should keep and tend the lower earth. The Gnostic texts are much tougher than the Hermetic texts. The Gnostic texts have a very stark vision that in the Gnostic system the material realm is wholly evil and the spiritual realm is completely separate from it. And it is a tragic cosmic accident that has resulted in the human predicament, that we are material creatures, but there is a divine spark within us. And the whole purpose of the Gnostic project was to liberate the divine spark in man, which meant liberating us from the chains of matter. So in summary, Gnosticism is ideas or coherent systems that are characterized by an absolutely negative view of the visible world and its creator, and the assumption of a divine spark in man, his inner self, which had become enclosed within the material body as a result of a tragic event in the pre-cosmic world from which it can only escape to its divine origins by means of the saving gnosis. Now, both Hermeticism and Gnosticism see reality in these starkly dualistic terms: dark and light, good and evil. The true God is the pleroma, the spiritual realm, and the world is the physical realm, and they don't intersect. They touch at the edge, but they don't intersect. And here's why the Gnostics got themselves into such a lot of trouble with the Roman Catholic Church, and indeed with all of the monotheistic faiths, because in the Gnostic scheme of things, this fellow, Yahweh, YHWH, the person that we have been taught to call God, and I don't mean to cause offense here to those who pursue this belief system, I'm simply reporting to you what the Gnostics believed. They said that this entity, this thing actually as they saw him, who called himself Yahweh, Jehovah, was not a god at all. They said he was a kind of demon who had hoodwinked mankind into believing that he was God. And there's that line in the movie The Usual Suspects, the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world he did not exist. The Gnostics took it a step further. The greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world that he is God. And therefore they saw the three monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, who all worship the same entity, as a kind of demon-worshipping cults, which had pulled off this trick on mankind, substituting a diabolical, pompous, overblown, egotistical entity which constantly demands worship, is extremely jealous, will not allow you to consider any other thing. This entity who will burn you at the stake if you actually don't believe in him. They saw the monotheistic faith as a kind of demon worship, and that's why the Roman Catholic Church set out to destroy Gnosticism. And the Gnostics were amongst the first to go to the stake and to suffer that horrible death. And they saw that this Yahweh had created the physical world and had created human beings, but that the universe took mercy on us and gave us this divine spark. And as I say, the Gnostic project was to free us, to free that divine spark in man. And the demiurge, the thing that we call God, was supported by archons, evil angels who would mingle with men and take the form of men and would mislead us, constantly mislead us down the path of darkness, so that we would never realize our divine spark. And the Gnostics had an extremely positive view of Christ. They saw him as the great Gnostic teacher who brought the healing gnosis to mankind, who brought the liberating knowledge. But again, he was hijacked by the archonic forces of the church and taken away. The true teachings of Christ were hijacked. And from the Gnostic point of view, it was an absurd idea that Christ would die for our sins. We have to take responsibility for our own sins. You can't have somebody dying for your sins. He came in a time of darkness to help us find the necessary gnosis to escape the demiurgic realm. So the Gnostic story of the Garden of Eden, like so many other things in Gnosticism, turns what we're familiar with completely upside down. We are taught, in the system of the demiurge, we are taught that the serpent was the bad guy, that there were Adam and Eve in the garden, they were living this pristine life in just total ignorance, and they dared to eat of the tree of knowledge. They attempted to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge by the serpent. And the serpent, and this is somehow a terribly wicked thing to do, that they should have knowledge of good and evil, because the entity that made them wants them to have no knowledge whatsoever, just to be completely ignorant and living in ignorance and darkness in the garden. And the serpent, by giving them the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we're told, has done a terribly wicked thing, and that the serpent is the devil, and that for this reason Adam and Eve are driven forth from the garden. Now, from the Gnostic point of view, the serpent is the good guy. From the Gnostic point of view, we've got to have knowledge of good and evil. How can we grow as spirits, as souls? How can we liberate the divine spark in ourselves if we're just these robots, who are not ever thinking for ourselves, who can never make a choice? Aren't we defined by our choices, the Gnostic said? How could we make a choice between good and evil if we don't even know what they are? Of course, from the Gnostic point of view, the serpent is the hero of the story, not the villain. And the serpent is bringing gnosis to Adam and Eve. And this is what happens to them, of course. They're driven out of the garden, their bottoms humiliatingly beaten by angels with swords. Angels are posted at the edges of Eden with whirling swords to prevent that they should ever gain access to the tree of life.
Oh, I'm done for today. Thank you. Thanks, Baron, for being here. Thank you, lurkers. Thank you, everybody.
Then they will become like us.
You all rule very much. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here.
Can't let them do that.
Kind of boring Graham Hancock speech. I've never seen it before. A little boring, but
good and evil, they're halfway there. We have to keep them away. So that you can see how the Gnostic.
I think I got to focus 100% to understand what he's really saying.
Religious take. And you can see how the Gnostics, why they suffered such horrendous persecution.
We might raid somebody, we might not.
Interestingly, in later Gnostic systems, which managed to survive in certain places with great difficulty,
Nah.
It's interesting that the tree of life.
No
is
raid
depicted
today.
as
Peace,
the
yo. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for being here, man.
This
Happy
is
birthday
amanita
weekend, buddy,
muscaria,
and I'll talk to you soon, man.
identifiable
See ya.
psychedelic
No raid
mushrooms
today.
used in shamanistic cultures all over the world. Are they telling us that there is something in the visionary experience that these plants allow us to have?